I'm sure a lot of people that click on this video have or had a favorite animated show that they loved as kids. Shows that help sculpt their personality and imagination, that taught them valuable life lessons on how to be a better person to the people around you. Shows that somehow were able to match that spontaneous nature of energy that we had at that age. For as long as I can remember, I've always had a passion for art and creativity, which in turn created a bias towards animation when it came to watching media because of how expressive it could be in the storytelling. I don't completely shut out live action shows altogether. I got my favorites in that area as well, but they just don't have nearly the same kind of impact on my eyes. But I didn't necessarily like when it came to the super realistic shows was that a lot of them had a darker color palette, a lot of those shots and scenes. Overall, I felt like they were doing everything in their power not to stand out. And as a kid, that just doesn't resonate well. Born in the 2000s, I remember glimpses of the latter half of the decade, but the 2010s is something I can remember vividly as an adult because those are my conscious years. And that was the time I gained an appreciation for animation as a whole. For me as a kid with limited channels on my TV, I, like the rest of y'all, knew about the big three: Cartoon Network, Nickelodeon, and Disney. So with Cartoon Network being my main source of entertainment when I was stuck at home, I got pretty familiar with what they had to offer. A lot of people regard the 2010s as being Cartoon Network's last good era, which I wholeheartedly agree with. I feel like that was the last time they gave new ideas a chance, where we got some personality out of the network. It was the last time Cartoon Network felt like there was a genuine passion behind it. Of course, I'm more so referring to the earlier half of the decade as opposed to the latter, as the latter is pretty much when they started to adopt the behavior we see today. But with that being said, I want to go over everything that made this era of Cartoon Network what it was. All the high moments, the lows, the smart decisions, the dumb ones, and how that ultimately cultivated a lot of our childhoods. We'll do a recap of the network's humble beginnings and work our way up to today. So up until the early 90s, there were almost no other channels that solely broadcasted animated original shows for the younger generation. That wasn't until Ted Turner acquired the licensing of hours worth of cartoons from a few heavy hitters in the Western animation industry, including Hanna-Barbera, Warner Brothers, and MGM. Turner is a pretty big name in television, being the founder of CNN and pioneering so much media in the industry. By this point, he was trying to start up his own broadcast channel, and with the newly acquired licensing of the cartoons, he had the perfect recipe to create something that was the first of its kind. In addition, Hanna-Barbera were also producing new shows that Turner was able to broadcast, meaning he didn't have to rely solely on re-airing the classics to have content, but he needed a name for it. After shoveling through ideas with the then senior VP of TNT, Betty Cohen, they landed on a simple yet impactful Cartoon Network. On October 1st, 1992, Cartoon Network was finally launched. In the following year, the network's first attempt at a mascot, Moxie, was introduced to audiences with his own self-titled series, making it the network's first exclusively original cartoon that lasted until 1996. In 1995, with a cartoon, later known as the Cartoons program block, made its television debut. Essentially, it was a show where viewers could watch the pilots of cartoons trying to get picked up by the network, and if the show was popular enough, it was greenlit. This was the push that many of the shows we know and love today needed to make its way onto our screens. The first generation of original cartoons truly laid the groundwork for the strong foundation Cartoon Network would have for the next 20 plus years, which is known as the Powerhouse era. Shows such as Dexter's Laboratory, Johnny Bravo, The Powerpuff Girls, Cow and Chicken, Ed, Ed and Eddie, Courage the Cowardly Dog were the reason why the network became among the top rated channels for the younger demographic alongside Nickelodeon. I want to go over some of the other great ideas and concepts the network had during this time, as some of the ideas did stick around going into the 2010s, but a lot of them were discontinued, which arguably contributed to the network's downfall. So most notably in 1995, Cartoon Network launched its first website, which initially served as an AOL site, but would later be changed and reformed into the iconic CartoonNetwork.com website. It would go on to feature a multitude of things for visitors, including show clips, promotional news, exclusive online games, and much more. I can still remember to this day playing a lot of the Flash games they had on the site. You had Billy and Mandy's Harem Scarum, Magnet Face, Foster's Home had A Friend in Need, and the banger that was Ben 10 Savage Pursuit. I don't know why, but for Ben 10, I remember that game being super hard to the point where I couldn't finish it when I was younger. It doesn't change the fact that I loved it and still love and reminisce about all these games today, but man, Flash games from back then were crazy. And like I said, there was so much more to the website than just the games, but for a kid who had to get creative in entertaining himself, Cartoon Network always came in clutch. But all of that wouldn't come into fruition until years down the line. Moving on for now, in 1997, the channel launched the Toonami block, showcasing Cartoon Network's versatility by introducing audiences to a medium that wasn't shown in Western media on a wide scale by this point: anime. The programming block was founded by Sean Akins and Jason DeMarco. This was honestly one of the smartest decisions they made in the network's history. Like I mentioned before, it was a lot of young people's first introduction to anime. It not only switched up the look by showing art styles that were vastly different from the Hanna-Barbera standard many were familiar with, but with so many action-packed shows on their lineup, It exposed so many young kids like myself to well-choreographed fight scenes that are forever ingrained into our heads. Even the aesthetic for the Toonami segments were hard. It played into that futuristic, tech-based, spacey vibe that was heavy into pop culture during the late 90s and early 2000s. Cartoon Network finally hit the mark with creating one of the most memorable mascots that quite literally ushered in the new generation for the network. Unfortunately, the block did stop its weekday airing by 2004, switching to a Saturday evening only schedule up until 2008, where it was taken off the airways altogether for the time being. Jump to 1999, and Cartoon Network started airing brief segments that feature original music from various artists played over clip scenes of characters from their programming lineup and Turner's animation library, under the guise of the Groovies and Shorties labels. The following year, Cartoon Network would launch their own spin-off network known as Boomerang. This is where all the classic shows Turner had in the stash were moved to as far as broadcasting, as a lot of them were taking up the airtime for the new shows coming in. Now with a whole bunch of airtime available, that of course came with the arrival of a plethora of new shows going into the early 2000s. Just to name a few, you had Samurai Jack, The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, Ben 10, Foster's Home, K&D, Camp Lazlo, Chowder, My Gym Partner's a Monkey, The Teen Titans, The Secret Saturdays, Total Drama Island, and so many more. Add that to the fact that Cartoon Network constantly aired promotional bumpers, locked in on merchandising and marketing, alongside theatrical releases, and you honestly couldn't tell them nothing during this time. Though as much success Cartoon Network saw in the 2000s, it was also a time they saw a lot of change and even experienced a lot of failure as well. Betty Cohen, who I mentioned before was one of the founders of Cartoon Network, was also serving as president since its launch. However, in 2001, she ended up resigning due to creative differences. Shortly after, Jim Samples would replace her. Most notably, this was around the time Adult Swim was finally launched, taking the nighttime programming hours, practically splitting Cartoon Network's audience in half. For most kids born in the 2000s, you already knew what time it was when you heard this. But honestly, the initial lineup for the adults were pretty good too. You had Awkward Teen Hunger Force, Home Movies, Harvey Birdman, Attorney at Law, and many others down the line as Adult Swim grew exponentially by the late 2000s and arguably hit its peak during the 2010s. Like I mentioned before, Cartoon Network had many changes and new launches ready for the new millennium. By 2002, their first theatrical film based on one of their original series, The Powerpuff Girls, was released. Unfortunately, the movie was considered a flop in terms of sales, just barely breaking even, garnering over $16 million worldwide on a budget of $11 million. There's a lot of reasons as to why the film fell as hard as it did, as the direction for what tone it was going to take was a mess on its own. Luckily, Cartoon Network didn't immediately pull the plug on the Powerpuff Girls show, nor was this the last time they would decide to curate a theatrical release. 2003 saw the end of the Cartoons era, putting a stop to the shorts of the same name. And in 2004, Cartoon Network saw its first big rebrand. I mean, they changed the fit, the aesthetic. This also brought one of the most iconic, memorable bumpers to ever grace television. Ever. Working with an Australian-based digital studio known as Animal Logic, Cartoon Network brilliantly launched a blend of CGI and 2D animation to form their own universe that consisted of all the characters from shows they've aired since launch called, you guessed it, CN City. You had characters from the new and old era of Cartoon Network walking around, interacting with one another, living their lives like normal citizens in this fictional world. It was a really clever way to show the progression of how far Cartoon Network had come by that point. But more importantly, it was a big old crossover. As a kid, I loved crossovers. The idea of seeing the people from your favorite shows in one setting and doing anything together never got old. And it's probably why it was especially so common during this decade across all networks. I didn't even care about the plot. Just the fact that two worlds collided for a half-hour special was more than enough to get me to tune in as a kid. I didn't watch the Cartoon Network bumpers when they aired live on TV. I was too young at the time. However, this wasn't the last time the network put their money makers together to create interesting bumpers for the channel. During 2008, the network saw another bit of a rebrand, starting up some more initiatives. They launched another program to introduce upcoming animated shows called the Cartoon Institute, and another new interstitial called Wedgies that aired a diverse group of animated shorts that some of you may know by the names of Big Baby, Colin Cat 22, Nacho Bear, and the talented Mr. Bixby. And most notably, Cartoon Network gave up the CN City bumpers in favor of the nudes promotion they were doing. There were these blank, faceless toy figures that used to run around a white backdrop, often looking for some color, and depending on the color that gravitated to them, they would turn into one of the characters from the network's lineup. Made in collaboration with Kid Robot and Capacity, this was actually one of the earliest bumpers I was able to catch while it actively aired on the network. Ultimately, I understood the concept, and it was a great way for them to try and keep the momentum and fun idea of involving different characters interacting with one another. I wouldn't be surprised if this was meant to be some sort of soft launch for a major collection or toy brand for the network, seeing as other manufacturers like Medicom Toy had global success with their Bear Brick collection, including Kid Robot themselves. And yes, while we're here, we might as well address that era of Cartoon Network as well. In 2009, the CN Real block was made to air live action shows on the Cartoon Network channel. There's not much to say about this block, as it was just ultimately a way to try and compete with Cartoon Network's other competitors and how their networks thrived off their live action lineup. But the shows they had were boring and unoriginal. You had Do What Will Happen, Bobby Says, and Destroy Build Destroy, just to name a few. Out of all of them as a kid, I did like Destroy Build Destroy because the idea of breaking and exploding something was any kid's dream. I mean, breaking stuff and getting away with it is like the entire appeal of being a kid, but it got old really fast, and I wasn't even tuning in that much to give it a chance. And anyway, it's been made clear that they're just sanitized versions of other popular reality television like Tosh Bourneau and Mythbusters. Now, I won't go too hard on this era as the shift was questionable, but it wasn't all bad. Despite the failure of the Powerpuff Girls theatrical release, the network continued to air special episodes and TV exclusive movies throughout its run. Some of those being live action adaptations of their popular shows that gave us Scooby-Doo The Mystery Begins and the Ben 10 live action films. Speaking of, apparently the budget for the second Ben 10 movie was $40 million. That's insane for a straight to TV production. But CN Real saw its end only a year after it launched, and it was for the best. Keep in mind, 2009 was also a weird time for the channel because while they were airing their live action shows, they didn't release any original animated series that year. It's part of why this time period is classed into the network's dark age. It's crazy to think about, like, taken to the fact that a lot of the shows that were currently running at this time were either on their way out or already left. And it seemed like the network had nothing lined up to close out that decade and bring in the new year. This wouldn't be until 2010 when Cartoon Network saw yet another rebrand by changing its logo once again. And here to save the network from evident obscurity came a variety of new shows such as Adventure Time, Regular Show, Generator Rex, and Symbionic Titan. This was also the start of Cartoon Network's Check It slogan. And because of the immediate success of the new generational cartoons coming out, the channel came to its senses and started to take their live action shows off the air. The early 2010s was actually a pretty strong time for the network, as in 2012 they would celebrate their 20th anniversary. They ended up relaunching their cartoon Planet Block and even took part in an anti-bullying campaign just to show how much they care about the kids. And thankfully in the same year, Cartoon Network relaunched their Toonami block for the late night time slot on Adult Swim on Saturdays. Unfortunately, their success this decade was waning. As most of you have probably caught on to by this point, Cartoon Network has the tendency to rebrand a lot. I'll be going over some of the few initiatives they made during this decade, the changes, the losses, and how that all played into causing a stain on their legacy before the 2010s was over. In regards to their shows, Cartoon Network was still holding its own and bringing in decent viewership during this time. Again, the early 2010s lineup of shows actually ended up being hits right out the gate, including other programs like Gumball, Steven Universe, We Bare Bears, and yes, even Teen Titans Go. Whether you think these shows could live up to what came before them or not is one thing, but I mean, we at least had something new and different to look at. I will admit that a good batch of these shows started to focus more on storyline and continuity compared to the previous eras. It was a common trope for a lot of them to have their first season come off as more episodic or not too serious in tone, simultaneously sprinkling in bits of lore and world building, then dropping plot-twisting bombshells on their viewers within the last few episodes of the seasons. And I can't lie, it worked every time. And Cartoon Network still had other shows that were at its core comedic and meant to resemble the unserious nature that classic Cartoon Network shows had. It's why we were given shows like Secret Mountain for Awesome, The Problem Solvers, and the Mad animated series, which I actually liked. I just hated the mascot. But in the same breath, we were also given the hidden gems like Uncle Grandpa, Clarence, and the Looney Tunes show. And while they were initially underrated and underpromoted during their run, these shows would find their audience years down the line. Safe to say the more comical shows didn't last too long on the network during this time, the only exception being Teen Titans Go, but Adventure Time had an overarching story as well as Steven Universe and eventually Gumball, which gave way to other cartoons following the same standard like Infinity Train, OKKO, and Craig of the Creek. It wasn't just for Cartoon Network though. The others in the big three started to greenlight more shows that had some sort of continuity in its series to seemingly keep audiences interested and coming back every week. For Disney, they had at least Gravity Falls, Star vs. and DuckTales, all of which were story-driven and became really popular. For Nick, they actually were pretty insistent on keeping their episodic comedies. We all know that SpongeBob is their golden child, and eventually The Loud House became another hit, but that didn't mean they avoided airing shows with a plot. People just didn't care. Like, they had two story-driven TMNT shows come out in the 2010s, but one got stale after a while, and the other people chose not to watch because of a DEI hire. Despite it being some of the best quality animation and combat choreography I've seen in years, Rise of TMNT, you deserve better. They also produced Glitch Text, which if I remember didn't air on the channel, but I mean the name is attached so I'll count it. For Nickelodeon and its audience, continuity for their shows didn't seem to work long term. So yeah, there was an obvious trend. Either you rose or you sank. And for Cartoon Network, most of their story-driven shows succeeded, but the network to me didn't give some of those shows a chance. One of the first notable victims victims of this was Symbionic Titan. As we discussed, this was one of their first new generation shows of this era and was ultimately part of the pack that emancipated the network from supposed doom in 2010. The show did garner a fan base for its story, but also mixed perception for certain scenes that aired live, but the channel ultimately pulled the plug because it apparently couldn't make a profit in toy merchandising. Generator Rex and their Thundercats reboot were also short-lived due to them being expensive to make and coming up short in toy sales, so this would set the precedent for their pattern of releasing the quality from their lineup. Maybe not just for the sake of toys, but just in general. It was a notorious thing for people who still watch Cartoon Network to roll their eyes at the programming. I mean, Teen Titans became so popular that every other show were basically left for dead in terms of airtime and marketing. Teen Titans Go got all the primetime slots for the new episodes while everyone else got the scraps, which is a horrible way to promote anything to the younger demographic. Like, I remember they had the audacity to air new Ben 10 Omniverse at like 6 a.m. in the morning, which was fine for me because I had to be up that early to catch the buzz anyway, but that's not every other viewer's story. And then some shows did catch the late night time slot, which was basically the last 30 minutes before Adult Swim switched on. Not as bad, but still crumbs compared to Teen Titans Go, which, keep in mind, also happened to get the only other worldwide theatrical release for a Cartoon Network original show since the Powerpuff Girls in 2002, surpassing that film by quintupling their budget in the global box office, which I'm sure furthered the network's bias towards the show. But fortunately, shows like Gumball, Steven Universe, and Rebrand Bears were able to establish themselves enough to get something, but Cartoon Network clearly had a favorite. And for good reason. I mean, they had 9 seasons made and are ongoing 12 years on the air, and despite the hate, it was Cartoon Network's most syndicated show they had in a while. Cartoon Network introduced a new batch of promotional bumpers by the mid-2010s, which weren't too bad, but compared to the innovation of the Powerhouse era, Sea and City, and even the Nudes, I feel like they needed a little more to make it stand out. The new dimensional bumpers arguably felt standard while maintaining the network's white, yellow, pink, and blue palette, coloring a lot of different characters from their lineup with those elements. There was even a Cartoon Network color palette art challenge that was popular a few years ago on the internet based on the newer eras. The mashup bumpers were also these short animated scenes of different cartoons with each frame colored differently from the last. Some featured the phrase "you made this" as a way to show the network involving the fans, which I will commend them for. It was a cool idea. Unfortunately, as far as their official website, which was a staple for a lot of kids' online entertainment in the 2000s and 2010s, fans noticed that it slowly started to descend into an archive for Cartoon Network shows rather than the official hub world some of us grew up on. All the games they had were slowly cut down to zero. By the late 2010s, as streaming was on the rise, it became the channel's last attempt at trying to get ahead of the curve before later being shut down completely in 2024. Oddly enough, in 2019, Cartoon Network found themselves in a similar position they were 10 years ago, with a lot of their successful lineup coming to an end. Going into the 2020s, they only had one ongoing show that had a super successful run and wasn't slowing down anytime soon. But what about the new era? I had long since stopped watching the channel by this point. I, like a lot of its viewers of yesteryear, grew up and moved on to other things, but it didn't change that I still wanted to at least hear that a new generation of shows was carrying the torch for the kids. I want to give a special spotlight to Craig of the Creek, as it's not only one of the last original shows to debut from the 2010s era, but to me it served as a great way to close out that era for the network. It was one of the only shows that I still kept up with via streaming during this run. Craig of the Creek aired its last episodes earlier this year, and on top of the fact it was great representation for Black households, relationship dynamics, and cultural representation for a lot of different people, the show was like an homage to the legacy Cartoon Network had leading up to its finale. There's so many callbacks, Easter eggs, references, done in a fun, clever way to make the experience enjoyable for all ages who tuned in. For context, if you don't know, the show centered around 10-year-old Craig Williams and other kids having adventures in the wilderness known as the Creek. It's where all the kids in the neighborhood chill after school during break or during the weekends. In particular, you had these characters called the Elders of the Creek, and there was these 3 guys who were teenagers older than the other kids, but still stuck around at the creek under a grotto called Elder Rock. They played board games, read manga, comics, reminisce about their childhood, all that. Those guys were like the main stories for the old school references for the show. They mentioned all the throwbacks, and it was initially 3 guys we were introduced to: Mark, Barry, and David, and then we were introduced to Kenneth, who was part of their OG friend group. And let me tell you, they did a phenomenal job wrapping up their storylines. Basically, the 3 of them throughout the show sort of struggled to grow into their teenage adulthood, especially Mark, while Kenneth was the only one who did grow up and went to college. Long story short, they had internal tension in the group leading up to the series finale, with Mark pushing everyone else away because he was scared of change and growing up. But by the end of the show, Mark acknowledged that he was being selfish. He apologized, and all the guys ended up being cool again, letting the new kids use their old hangout spot as a recreational archive joint, embracing the new generation and moving on to the next chapter in their lives. To me, this was such a nod to all the people who grew up on Cartoon Network pre-2020s. perfectly encapsulating the point that a lot of people go through in their lives where they might have to give up old habits in favor of embracing newer, better things into their lives as a part of growing up. Even with that last bit where I said the elders embrace the new generation, I feel like Cartoon Network should take that as a sign to leave the shows of the past alone and let them have their legacy as the classics. As you may know, there are some new shows for Cartoon Network coming up, but a lot of them are reboots. There's nothing wrong with reviving older shows and allowing them to receive better justice to their previously abrupt endings, or just to reignite the excitement of the people. A reboot may come off as a cash grab, but it's typically going to get attention. It's just sad to see that a lot of Cartoon Network's newer lineup seem to be consisting primarily of renewals for intellectual properties that we're all too familiar with. It seems like the 2020s doesn't have that new show that will emancipate the network like the early 2010s lineup did. Yes, there are new ideas coming, but y'all know how these companies can be. If it's not for their veterans, the marketing and promotion is going to be trash or non-existent. Cartoon Network is nothing like it once was. It's almost like they're turning off all the lights before finally leaving the room. They moved from their original studio building. The Adult Swim block starts before the sun even goes down, and they shut down their official website in the US. Business-wise, they're only doing what's best for them going into the digital streaming age. I get it. A lot of networks, even with prep time, still weren't prepared for the shift the industry took. Despite it all, I like to think that there's hope. Maybe not in the programming we once knew, but maybe through other sources. So many artists are starting up their own ideas independently, and there's a good few that have seen a lot of success, garnering a huge fan base of people willing to support them. There's always going to be a change with each coming generation, so when I say this, my intention is not to allude to the idea that Cartoon Network and other channels like it are dead. Rather, what I'm saying is this upcoming generation will inevitably grow up on something entirely different from what we did. Their favorite show could come from a creator that started on the same platform that you're watching this video on. And honestly, that blows my mind.